This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Heavy police deployments in Khartoum as former security officers stage a protest over severance packages. Fresh efforts to unite Libya's warring sides following the collapse of peace talks. China and the US set to finalize phase 1 of a crucial trade agreement. Hello and a warm welcome to Africa Live on CGTN. I'm Lindy Mtongana in Nairobi. Also coming up this hour, a stalemate between Egypt, Sudan and Ethiopia on the Grand Nile Dam after 2 days of talks in Washington. And in sports, South Africa looking to improve on their performance as they name a 15-member squad for the Women's Cricket World Cup. We start the hour in Sudan, which has reopened its airspace following clashes between security forces that left 2 soldiers dead. Ex-security agents linked to Omar al-Bashir's old regime clashed on Tuesday with government forces supporting the new transitional administration. The former employees have been protesting over severance packages in the capital, Khartoum. They opened fire near the National Intelligence and Security Service where they once worked. Ex-security agents also shut down 2 oil fields in Darfur, which produce around 5,000 barrels of oil a day. Heavy security has been deployed in Khartoum. The government says it is now in charge of all intelligence buildings after negotiations with the dismissed NISS staff members. In a televised address, Information Minister Faisal Mohammed Saleh said the violence has been contained.
Some parts of the capital witnessed rebellion from the forces pertaining to the night protests in the city of Obeid, which the armed forces and security forces have dealt with, retaining peace in the streets and neighborhoods.
Well, let's get you the very latest now from Khartoum. We're joined on the line by a local resident, Sarah Al-Najjar, for more on the situation. Sarah, can you give us an update on what the security situation has been like in Khartoum overnight and indeed now? Has the situation returned to normal?
Yeah, hi. The situation was extremely tense last night, especially when we could hear intermittent gunfire, and then later there was heavy shelling and mortars were fired. So it was extremely tense last night. People were following developments on social media, etc. They were worried that things would get out of hand. But then there was a press conference in the early hours. People were reassured that the government had taken control of the building, the National Intelligence Service building, and that everything was under control. I had a little drive around about half an hour ago. There's definitely fewer cars on the street. However, things seem to be getting back to normal. In fact, I drove past the building, the compound, the security compound where all the standoff was yesterday, and there were a few rapid support force vehicles in front, but they seem to be driving off after everything is under control. Schools are on holiday today. They've been given a day off because of what happened last night. So although there are fewer cars, I think things are getting back to normal.
Sarah Al-Najjar, thank you so much for that update, joining us on the line from Khartoum. Now, in other news, the world watches as yet another attempt at resolving the Libyan conflict has seemed to collapse. Military commander Khalifa Haftar left Moscow after failing to sign a ceasefire deal with his rival Fayez al-Sarraj, who already signed that agreement. Haftar asked for more time to look over the deal that was meant to bring an end to a 9-month offensive on the capital, Tripoli. However, the truce now remains up in the air after he left without committing to the agreement. Today, the Libyan Eastern Parliament Speaker, Aguila Saleh, is in Egypt to appear before the Arab Parliament over that conflict. Well, let's bring you more on this. For the latest update, we're joined by our correspondent in Cairo, Adel Al-Mahrawi. Adel, of course, we know that the Arab Parliament is set to be hosting Libyan officials today. Tell us more about what's expected to come from that meeting.
Well, this is a regular meeting for the Arab Parliament. The Arab Parliament is basically a subsidiary body formed from the Arab League, and it's mainly concerned with the heads or the speakers of Arab parliaments. Together they sit to discuss joint legislative efforts and political policies in the region. This session particularly has been designated to discuss the Libyan conflict and the recent updates that you've been talking about during this week and the previous one as well. Aqila Saleh, the Speaker of the Libyan Parliament, the only elected body in Libya and once recognized by the international community prior to the government of national accord, has been giving his speech to the Arab world. Aqila Saleh, who enjoys a lot of support from countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, was speaking about the situation in Libya, and he was asking the Arab countries to withdraw their recognition from the government of national accord.
And of course, Adele, some disappointment in how things ended in Moscow with Khalifa Haftar asking for 2 days at least to consider the truce. Now, those 2 days have lapsed. What do we expect to happen next?
Well, there have been some movements around Tripoli. The forces of the LNA, which is led by Khalifa Haftar, have been sort of mobilizing soldiers around the Tripoli area. Nothing major has broken out. Few minor breaches to the ceasefire have been reported, but nothing of major concern. But the movements indicate that there may be some kind of movements or resumption of the attack soon. Nothing has been confirmed or announced by Khalifa Haftar. It is highly unlikely that he will subdue or sign the contract, the ceasefire agreement by today, especially about what we've heard Aqila Saleh in Cairo says in the morning, which were severe criticism to Faiz Sarraj, holding him responsible and blaming him of aiding terrorist organizations and sheltering extremist militias. So this kind of tone, and Aqila Saleh, Khalifa Haftar come from the same political background, they support one another. It doesn't seem that the eastern powers of Libya are willing to yield or compromise and sign the ceasefire agreement, which they do not believe would be effective unless there is a clear term and a pathway to dismantle the militias and make them hand their weapons.
Well, thank you so much for that update. Adel Al-Mahrawi joining us there live from Cairo. Well, staying with this story, let's get the latest now from Turkey. We're joined from Istanbul by CGTN's Michal Bardavid. Michal, of course, we know that the Turkish president had very strong words for Khalifa Haftar after not signing that truce, saying that he would teach him a lesson. How is this likely to affect future talks, considering world leaders are expected to meet in Berlin on the weekend?
Well, yes, Lindy, in his threatening words, basically, Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan also stated that it is Turkey's duty to protect their kin in Libya. Now, it's important to note and first of all understand that the Turkish parliament has also approved sending Turkish troops to Libya in support of the GNA, and Erdogan has also stated that they have already started the deployment. So basically, his words seem to be a direct message to General Khalifa Haftar of the Libyan National Army, saying that Turkey will not back down, that if these ceasefire efforts fail, that Turkey would not hesitate to take action. So it would seem that Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan expects his threatening words to basically intimidate Haftar before this Berlin conference and give more power to the government of national accord at the negotiating table in Berlin as well. Now, Turkish officials also believe that even the presence of Turkish troops would be a deterring factor to the LNA in Libya. So these statements, it seems, would be aiming to strengthen the situation for Turkey, and that hope that Haftar would also become more inclined to sign a deal rather than walk away.
And Mikhail, of course, we know that Turkey has played a significant role in trying to bring peace to Libya. But this Berlin conference on Sunday introduces a number of new players to the scene. We'll see the UK will be represented, the United States, the likes of China, and of course Germany. Tell us more about how these new international players might shape the agenda of that summit.
Well, it seems right now they have a big opportunity with the Moscow talks failing last week between the Russian delegation, Turkish delegation having talks with the LNA and with the GNA. I think that really taught a lesson regarding what failed and what can be done differently in the Berlin conference. And that gives the opportunity for these international members to try and find a political solution, strategies to find a political solution. In the invitation, Germany states that the conference will aim to support the work of the United Nations towards a sovereign Libya and a reconciliation process. So that will basically what is going to be the agenda for the Berlin conference. Now we know that Haftar declined, saying that their requests were not met. So it's going to be important to see that whether or not in the Berlin conference they will be able to find ways that would be finding solutions for all parties involved, not for just the GNA, which already approved the situation that was talked in Moscow, but also for Haftar forces to be satisfied and well, and also for all the parties involved, including the new members, to be satisfied with the Berlin process.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle Bar-David, joining us there live from Istanbul. And of course, that Berlin conference set to take place on Sunday. Now, despite the ceasefire deal brokered by Turkey and Russia between the two warring sides in the Libyan conflict, tensions remain high, especially around the northern coast of the country, which recently saw fighting in some areas. Public opinion remains divided over what's best for the country. CGTN's Brian Toussaint reports.
This week, forces from the Libyan National Army allied to Khalifa Haftar announced that they had taken over Sirte and the surrounding districts. The government of national accord denied this as rumors, but later said that they withdrew from the strategic coastal city to avoid bloodshed. Libyans living along Sirte and al-Wishka have experienced regime changes several times, including once being under the control of the Islamic State in 2015. Some are banking on the LNA forces to repel militias regardless of a ceasefire.
I'm against the ceasefire because we have to build military and police forces to end the militias, as they've caused bad consequences to the country.
Others have welcomed the move, citing that stability and peace can be established through a mutual deal and political dialogue.
We support the decision of a ceasefire. In fact, it will give all the sides a chance to sit down and talk with each other to stop the war.
Most of us in Sirte support the ceasefire because we have shed too much blood and lost too many lives. A ceasefire is a wise decision.
Libya has been in a civil war since the fall of former leader Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. The conflict birthed two rival governments, the Tripoli-based government of national accord and a government allied to the Eastern Libyan National Army. Several other armed militias of different backgrounds also emerged and have been fighting each other to take power. Brian Toussaint, CGTN.
China and the United States are poised to finalize a Phase 1 trade agreement after nearly 2 years of negotiations. A Chinese delegation led by Vice Premier and Chief Negotiator Liu He is in Washington, where Liu will sign the deal later today with U.S. President Donald Trump. CGTN's Nathan King has more from the White House.
Full working morning for Vice Premier Liu He and the rest of the Chinese delegation here in Washington. First of all, meeting with the IMF Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva. The IMF, of course, very key in issuing stark warnings about the effect of the US-China trade war on the global economy, especially slowing global growth and worries about investment. Then afterwards, key US business leaders, including the President, Craig Allen of the US-China Business Council, a key bridge between the economic relationship between Washington and Beijing. And he's kind of upbeat about this Phase 1 deal.
The agreement will not be full, it will not be perfect, but it is a substantial step forward, and it addresses some of the major concerns of American companies.
We're also, through various briefings and leaks, getting an idea of some of what we can see in that Phase 1 deal in the next 24 hours. Remember, the US president's been fixated on the trade deficit between the US and China, and we've talked a lot about pledges by China to increase agricultural buying to about 40 to $50 billion. We'll expect larger numbers, we're told, in the energy sector, in manufacturing, and similar numbers when it comes to services as well. And of course, chapters, as we've mentioned, on market access, IP protection, and new mechanisms so the relationship can become more strategic when it comes to the economic links between the two countries. There's been lots of headlines about tariffs staying in place after this Phase 1 deal. In fact, about $360 billion worth of Chinese goods, about 2/3 of imports, will still remain under tariff, although at lower levels, and some, of course, have been scrapped.
These tariffs will stay in place until there's a Phase 2. If the president gets a Phase 2 quickly, he'll consider releasing tariffs as part of Phase 2. If not, there won't be any tariff relief.
So don't expect this war to go away. And remember, the US president has indicated recently that a Phase 2 deal may not happen until after the next election, of which he's running for his second term. So as some news agencies have reported, it is likely that some tariffs would stay in place potentially until after the November election. Nathan King, CGTN at the White House.
Well, let's get you more now on the China-US trade deal. We're joined from Beijing by our reporter Sun Ye. Sun Ye, ahead of the signing of the China-US Phase 1 trade deal, what have the Chinese delegation let on about the deal? What do we know so far?
Well, Lindy, the Chinese delegation in Washington hasn't really made any public announcement, but as we have heard, Chinese Vice Premier Liu He, who is China's chief negotiator, has met U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer ahead of the training of the Phase 1 trade deal, which is scheduled for Wednesday noon in Washington. They have been putting the final touches to the deal. And also in Washington, Liu He also met with IMF officials and people of U.S.-China Business Council. And these people in business have said they hope the deal will ease almost 2 years of tension between the two countries. As for an exact breakdown of that Phase 1 deal, it will not be published until it is signed. But a few key points of that reported 86-page document have been released. U.S. said it would include a scaling back of tariffs by both sides. The two countries have both retracted part of their retaliatory tariffs. And U.S. officials said the document would include China's agreement to buy $200 billion worth of agricultural products, as well as manufactured goods and energy services, though China has not verified that number. The document is expected to also have agreement clauses on ways to protect intellectual property rights. That's an issue both sides are committed to, but had previously done in different terms. Lindy?
Well, it sounds like the deal could span a number of areas, and that will be welcome news across the world. Certainly, the tension has had an impact in China with trade and the market. So tell us, Sun Ye, what are the sentiments like in China ahead of the signing of the deal?
Right, Lindy, indeed, it's welcome news here in China too. Also, U.S. removed China from its list of currency manipulator on Tuesday. Many viewed it as one of those goodwill gestures leading up to the Phase 1 deals. And Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson had said that this again shows China acts responsibly in the global arena and that it will continue to act responsibly in the future. Also, China released its trade figures for 2019 Tuesday. It has continued to grow to over 31 trillion yuan in 2019. The past year also saw a record rise in China's imports of commodities, but China's imports from the U.S. did plunge over 20% in 2019 from a year earlier. So officials at the General Administration of Customs said that increased imports from the U.S. from the phase 1 deal will not affect China's import volume from other countries because Chinese market is deep and verified, so it will be able to meet all those needs. We've also talked to people in the business community here in Beijing, including those in the high-tech industry. They are also mostly hopeful of the upcoming trade deal, saying that stable expectations instead of the weary protest that went on for 18 months is the kind of boost and stabilizer the business really needs. Lindy?
Thank you so much, Sunya, reporting live there from Beijing. We will keep you updated on the story as it develops throughout the day. Well, time now for a short break. Here's what's still ahead on the program. Coming up, the toll of terror. Nigeria honors its fallen soldiers. And more than 2,000 illegal firearms surrendered to the police in South Africa.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Africa Live. Find your voice. France, Britain and Germany have triggered a dispute mechanism in response to Iran's recent moves to end its commitments under the 2015 nuclear deal. The mechanism could lead to UN sanctions against Tehran. Iran dismissed the step as a strategic mistake. The European powers said they were acting to avoid a crisis over nuclear proliferation as tensions escalate in the Middle East. CGTN's Michael Voss has more.
The prospect of a wider military conflict over the US assassination of Iran's top general is receding, but the war of words continues along with splits between the US and Europe. In response to the attack, Iran announced it's taking the fifth step in reducing its commitments, lifting all limits on its ability to enrich uranium. European leaders had urged Tehran to reverse that decision. Now they've decided to act. As the EU Parliament met on Tuesday to discuss the crisis in the Middle East, its foreign policy chief announced that Iran was now under notice of an official dispute.
The aim of the dispute resolution mechanism is not to reimpose sanctions. The aim of this mechanism is to resolve issues relating to the implementation of the agreement.
US President Donald Trump has called on Europe, Russia and China to declare the deal dead and pull out altogether. Britain's Prime Minister says that if that's the case, then the US should come up with its own alternative deal.
My point to our American friends is, look, somehow or other, we've got to stop the Iranians acquiring a nuclear weapon. I think that's what the Joint Collective Points Agreement does, the JCPOA. But if we're going to get rid of it, then we need a replacement.
In Iran, protests continue over the government's handling of the shooting down of the Ukrainian passenger jet, killing everyone on board. The authorities announced that there have now been arrests and the creation of a special court.
The judiciary should form a special court with a high-ranking judge and dozens of experts. This is not a usual and ordinary case. The entire world will be watching this court.
Iran has called the European move unconstructive. For the moment, the nuclear deal is not dead, but the chances of reviving it are slim. Even if the US, which unilaterally pulled out in 2018, did come up with alternative proposals, Tehran is unlikely to return to the negotiating table as long as the tough US sanctions remain in place. Michael Voss, CGTN, Brussels.
Now, meanwhile, Iran's President Hassan Rouhani has called for national unity after the accidental downing of the Ukrainian airliner. Rouhani also says the armed forces should apologize and explain what happened.
The thing that must come out of this tragedy is national unity, love of country, national harmony. The result cannot be national disunity.
China, another signatory of the Iran nuclear deal, is also weighing in on the latest developments. The country's foreign minister has urged all sides to exercise restraint and to resolve the issue through dialogue and negotiations.
China regrets that Britain, France and Germany have launched a dispute mechanism for the 2015 Iran nuclear agreement. We believe this measure will not help resolve the issue and will not help ease current tensions. China always believes that there is a reason for Iran to reduce its implementation of the agreement. Washington unilaterally withdrew itself from the agreement, ignoring international law and obligations, exerting extreme pressure on Iran and obstructing other parties from fulfilling their obligations. These are the root causes of Iran's nuclear tensions.
The U.S. House of Representatives will vote on Wednesday to send articles of impeachment against President Trump to the Senate. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says she would name the team of impeachment lawyers, also called managers, to handle the case. Democrats say they'll also provide new evidence. The House impeached Trump last month for abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says the trial could start as early as next week.
And we'll be able to, we believe, if that happens, in all likelihood, go through some preliminary steps here this week, which could well include the Chief Justice coming over and swearing in members of the Senate and some other kind of housekeeping measures. We hope to be able to achieve that by consent, which would set us up to begin the actual trial next Tuesday.
The Nigerian government says it will make budgetary allocations to support families of the country's fallen soldiers. Hundreds of troops have been killed and their families left destitute during the country's decade-long fight against Islamist militant group Boko Haram. But the country is now remembering the sacrifices of these men and women, as CGTN's Kelechi Emekalam reports.
A rush of excitement here as widows and families of slain soldiers receive relief materials. Life has been difficult for them. With their breadwinners killed in the line of duty, they're left alone to fend for themselves in a harsh economy. But these supplies would help to cushion the effect of the hardship.
Well, we know the economy of these days, the economy of our country today. It is not as fair as we know it used to be. And we know a bag of rice costs for about 24,000 to 25,000 naira. And getting a bag of rice for free at this time in 2020 is going to go a long way to sustain the family.
Since 2009, Nigerian soldiers have been confronting terrorist groups Boko Haram and ISWAP. Many have lost their lives in the battlefront, but their sacrifices have remained largely unnoticed. But things are about to change for the better, as government is set to implement plans that would enhance the lives of Nigerian soldiers living and fallen.
This is the commitment that the federal government, through the president, has made to do better for our veterans and the families of our fallen heroes, and to improve the conditions of those who serve today. And we shall do so incrementally, making provisions in the annual budgets. And we do not and will not take our men and women of the armed forces for granted.
Efforts of men and women in the military has helped largely to restrain insurgents from taking over territories. And in a show of appreciation, individuals and groups have also pledged their continuous support for families of the fallen soldiers, especially to sponsor their children in schools. Kelechi Emekalam, CGTN Abuja, Nigeria.
To South Africa now, where more than 2,000 illegally possessed firearms have been surrendered to the police across the country. The surrender of the weapons is part of an amnesty program requiring those with illegal guns to turn them in within 6 months or face prosecution. CGTN's Yulisa Njamela has more.
The amnesty is part of government's plan to tackle the accumulation of firearms in South African communities and to deal decisively with the excess of illegal firearms. While it's unclear how many illegal guns there are in South Africa, lobby group Gun Free SA estimates that there are at least 4.5 legal weapons in this country, and 37 of those are lost or stolen every day. The firearm amnesty period started on the 1st of December 2019. It will run until the end of May.
To say that the fire amnesty period has kicked off on a good note would be an understatement. In less than 50 days since the firearms amnesty period commenced, a total of 2,266 firearms have been surrendered to various police stations across all provinces.
A Johannesburg arms dealer took up the call by the South African Police Service to surrender unwanted or unlicensed firearms. Chris van der Berg handed over his firearms and ammunition as he says they're outdated and have no commercial value, but still deadly.
I want to pause and thank all those South Africans and Mr. van der Berg here to say this gives the dent to the crime and this gives the dent to the criminal activities out there.
This is the fourth such amnesty since 1994. The South African Police Service is strengthening its capacity to recover unlawful weapons. Ballistic tests are conducted on all surrendered firearms to check if they were used in any crime.
Firearms remain the enemy of our society, and we as SEPs must do all in our power to protect communities from these illegal acquired weapons. The declaration of this amnesty period is in the interest of the public, and I believe it will make a dent in dealing decisively with the excess of illegal firearms and wanted firearms that end up in the wrong hands.
The minister believes that the amnesty period is sufficient time for South Africans to hand over their illegal firearms. Yulisa Njamela for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Time for a short break. Your business news up next. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa calls on business leaders to help finalize land redistribution this year. And UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson hints at turning to Huawei for the UK's 5G mobile network.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has asked business leaders to present solutions to redistribution of land to the majority black population. The request comes as the government works to finalize changes to legislation and the constitution to allow for the expropriation of land without compensation. The ruling African National Congress plans to change the constitution and make it easier to seize land without paying for it. That in turn aims to address racially skewed ownership patterns dating back to colonialism and white minority rule. Ramaphosa has also asked business leaders to play a more proactive role in land expropriation through a donations policy, which will allow companies to voluntarily give up underutilized land to communities whose land was taken away. Still in South Africa, retrenchments in the banking sector remain a concern as the so-called Big Four banks in the country assess the number of staff as well as branch infrastructure. Thousands of jobs could be at stake Angela Coppola has more.
The banking sector is depressed when it comes to valuations compared to banking sectors in other emerging markets, which is good news for investors.
South African banks remain profitable in their own right and substantially profitable relative to balance sheet. So I would venture that it's the mood, more than anything, that's driving valuation on South African banks.
While that may be an opportunity for investors, staff are feeling the pressure because technology is beginning to turn the traditional business banking model on its head.
It's all about automation, and really it's around jobs being replaced by RPA processes. The thing is that these processes don't just start immediately. Banks obviously focus on optimization and efficiencies, and so they've been setting up processes, and they have a plan, a strategic plan. And of course there's alternatives, but the workplace of the future, it's interesting that with AI and automation, there's actually more jobs that will be created than jobs taken away.
Added to that, there are new entrants that are starting to vie for market share.
The displacement, the dislocation comes out of the technology cluster, where it's not other banks that are competing for share of market, but entirely new ventures, different industries that are giving birth to competition. So that has given the retail banking industry a substantial shake.
The local financial services worker union, SASPO, has been fighting the banks over planned retrenchments and branch closures. They are currently in the courts, trying to stop those job losses.
In an environment of unionization, it's a very sensitive topic, and so everyone has to be on the same page in terms of automation, what the workplace looks like. And I think it's a responsibility that lies not just with the business, which is banks in this case, but lies with the unions and lies with the employees. Everyone's got to take responsibility for what do we need to do to be relevant in the future.
As banks continue to watch their costs, it's probably very likely that there are going to be more retrenchments sooner rather than later, especially with those new competitors coming in. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Sandton, South Africa.
Still on banking matters, 8% of Zimbabwe's bank workers were retrenched in 2019. The country's deep economic crisis partially explains that trend, but not all of it. A move towards more automation of services also led to job cuts, and those who still remain could soon be in the firing line. As CGTN's Farai Mokotoya now reports, they're being urged to reskill or risk getting left behind.
A shrinking formal sector has whittled down the bankable population. At the same time, operating costs have been escalating, piling pressure on financial institutions. This, even before we talk about cash shortages, which have accelerated the need for rationalization.
Even if I was an executive of a bank and I'm looking at the cost of having 9 bank tellers versus, just having 2 or just digitizing my process, it's much more efficient. The audit trail is better. So many things are better when you're doing things using that ICT space.
About 300 employees out of an estimated 4,000 strong banking sector workforce were laid off in 2019 under labor laws that allow employers to dismiss workers on notice and only pay them 2 weeks' wages for every year they've served. With more job losses forecast, those engaged in some of the routine work are being urged to adapt in order to remain relevant in the new order.
There is some advisory work that will still be needed. The banks will still be very relevant, where you actually have to visit and talk to someone the way we are talking now and say, I want to invest in this particular industry. What will be your advice? The person will need to take that kind of information, prepare some research report and give you particular advice.
If I was a bank teller right now, I'd be looking for some sort of an ICT course, data analysis, something along those lines, because as we digitize, a lot more of those skills are going to be required, and they're not presently here. Globally, they think that there are going to be 30 million jobs that are going to be wiped out, 30 million traditional jobs that are going to be wiped out, but an additional 70 million are going to be created, centering in the ICT space.
That means the relentless march towards automation isn't all doom and gloom, especially for those who are willing to embrace it. Farai Mokotoya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
The January 15th deadline has arrived for officials from Egypt, Sudan and Ethiopia to find a solution to a dispute over a hydraulic dam. They've been meeting in Washington, D.C., but so far no advancements have been made after 2 days of talks. Our Washington correspondent, Jagruti Dave, has been following the developments.
Time is running out on the latest rounds of talks on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which started on Monday in Washington, D.C., brokered by U.S. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin and the World Bank. The dam is set to become the largest hydraulic dam in Africa. Ethiopia began construction in 2011 and it's nearly 70% complete. However, Egypt relies on 90% of its water supplies on the Nile River. It fears that its already scarce water supplies will be further depleted if the dam is filled up too quickly. However, Addis Ababa says Cairo's timeframe of 12 to 21 years to fill the dam is not acceptable. It says the dam is crucial for its own economic development and denies that it will affect water supplies for Egypt's 100 million plus population. In addition, Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed asked South African leader Cyril Ramaphosa to intervene on Ethiopia's behalf over the weekend. We are willing to play a role in whatever agreement can be crafted and remain supportive to finding solutions between countries on our continent, said President Ramaphosa at a press conference in Pretoria on Sunday. Ethiopia hopes the dam will enable it to be Africa's biggest exporter of energy. Egypt hopes that it can avert what it sees as an existential crisis. The stakes are high for these talks in Washington, D.C. as crunch time approaches. I'm Jagruti Dave for CGTN in Washington.
Senegal's President Macky Sall has inaugurated the country's first ceramic factory just outside Dakar. It's owned by Chinese firm Twyford, which has a presence in Ghana, Tanzania and Kenya. Several Senegalese ministers and Zhang Shun, Chinese ambassador to Senegal, attended the launch. The factory covers 40 hectares of land and cost $80 million to build. President Sall says the factory has an important place in the industrial fabric of Senegal and will create numerous jobs for locals.
I would like to express my satisfaction and my encouragement to the company Twyford Ceramics for the choice made on Senegal to establish this gigantic industrial unit, the most important in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of investments and production capacity.
The Twyford factory in Senegal has had investment by two well-known ceramic manufacturing companies in China and is ranked amongst the best in the world in the ceramic industry. After its official launch, the factory will generate nearly $6 million in state taxes every year.
The first reason we choose Senegal is because of the market. As you can see, in Western Africa, especially the Francophone Africa country, there are not ceramic factory here. So we build the first ceramic factory, then we can get to the market as soon as possible.
UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson says he may be ready to endorse Huawei for some non-core elements in Britain's next-generation 5G mobile network. His comments come as a delegation of senior US officials arrived in London to warn against Britain using equipment from the Chinese communications giant. Richard Bestick reports.
Huawei has been operating in Britain for 18 years, slowly building a loyal customer base. Now, Britain appears to be preparing for at least some Huawei equipment in non-core elements of its upgraded 5G network.
The British public deserve to have access to the best possible technology. I've talked about infrastructure and technology. We want to put in a gigabit broadband for everybody. Now, if people oppose one brand or another, then they have to tell us what's the alternative, right? On the other hand, let's be clear. I don't want, as a UK Prime Minister, to put in any infrastructure that is going to prejudice our national security or our ability to cooperate with Five Eyes intelligence.
Some in Britain's telecoms industry argue Huawei's equipment can be used as part of non-core elements that guarantee the security of British networks. Huawei has always denied it poses a security risk. Founder Ren Zhengfei has said that the Chinese government has never asked his company to spy on its behalf. However, US President Donald Trump has lobbied hard to have the Chinese company banned in the UK in its entirety, claiming it will use the equipment as a spying tool. The final decision for the British government then a balancing act. Go ahead with Huawei, and it could possibly damage hopes of a lucrative trade deal when the UK departs the European Union at the end of the month. Say no, and Britain's rollout of 5G could be badly delayed. And as some Huawei kit is already installed, mobile phone companies like Vodafone here warn that unravelling it could cost hundreds of millions. Expect a decision on Huawei imminently and expect some kind of compromise. Richard Bestick, CGTN, London.
Let's take a short break now. Here's what's still ahead on Africa Live. Coming up, African designers showcase the best of their creations at the Berlin Mercedes-Benz Winter Fashion Week.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
African designers are showcasing the best of their creations at the Berlin Mercedes-Benz Winter Fashion Week, which kicked off on Monday. 4 South Africans presented their collections at the opening group show as part of an emerging talent program. They displayed a mix of materials focusing on sustainability and wearability. The aim of their designs was to bring an African story to the stage. This year's event has brought a contemporary look to the German capital. It all comes to a close on Friday.
So the collection I'm showing tonight is called Al-Kebulan, and Al-Kebulan is the oldest name for Africa. And so the reason I named it this and the reason why it's my inspiration is because I was trying to reimagine Africa without all the pain and all the pain and suffering that we faced. So it was almost like from a child's eye.
This is inspired by the alchemical principles of as above, so below. And you can see within the coloring also when you look at sulfur and mercury and salt, which were basically the base elements that they tried to mix together to create gold. So those are all precious stones and minerals mixed with a little bit of plastic that's upcycled, of course. I love that contrast, that like liminal line where is it acceptable to put like diamonds with plastic?
In that sense, if you look tonight, what we're showing you is a complete mix of what we're saying is completely current now fashion, but has come from 6 or 7 years of our collection. So it's not about this season, it's about many seasons that still are beautiful, still beautiful pieces. You can still wear them, they still look fantastic on the ramp. You can not even recognize that you ever saw them before.
And coming up in your sports news, up next. South Africa looking to improve on their performance as they name a 15-member squad for the Women's Cricket World Cup.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa. Were you born to be a player? Could this moment be yours? Sports Scene. Find